Good morning. This year has brought into sharp focus the levels of violence and abuse that children and women have been facing in their own lives. It has also reminded us how important it is for communities to pull together and respond to the challenges we've all been facing. Advance is a community-based organization that supports women and families to be safe and free from abuse, and it was founded 22 years ago as a community response itself. 6 years ago, Advance coordinated a partnership of 10 community organizations and 3 local authorities, and together we formed the Angelou Partnership. Today, you're going to hear about our experiences over the past 6 years, what we've learned from it, and how you can implement this as part of your policy, your local authority, your practice as a community organization. My name is Nikki Scordi. I'm the CEO of Advance, and I will be introducing you to our first 2 speakers. The first one is Shabana Kosar, who is the VAWG Strategic League for the 3 local authorities. And after Shabana, you'll hear from Jess Asato from Safe Lives, the head of policy for Safe Lives, who have carried an evaluation of our work in the past 5 years. So over to you, Shabana.
Thanks, Nikki. And hi, good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here and to speak a little bit around the background to why this approach was so important. So as Nikki said, I'm the Violence Against Women and Girls lead for the 3 boroughs, and that covers Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea, and City of Westminster. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background. So in 2010, actually, I believe, the 3 local authorities became merged into what was a sort of tri-borough arrangement. And in 2015, they came together to develop a shared violence against women and girls strategic partnership to really deliver the response to VAWG within the vital framework which we have locally, which is our coordinated community response. And during this merger, there was a real review done into identifying what are the gaps in services, what's the need, and what does the service need to look like. And this was done through widespread consultation and by utilising the expertise of the IMCAN and Women's Aid Capacity Building Partnership, which was really important because what it felt was there needed to be an independent oversight into how we should be working locally. And so as a result of this work and what was happening on the grassroots, it was clear that there needed to be a new approach to better support survivors of VAWG. Next slide, please. And really what that review and that consultation showed was a number of key areas. And I think as I go through these, some of them are probably going to be familiar to you even now, sadly. But what we definitely know was that there tends to be, when it comes to VAWG, inconsistent provision. So in some strands of VAWG, you might see more perhaps in domestic abuse, less in others, and it can be quite patchy. What we also found was that, sadly, for many survivors, access to service was a bit of a postcode lottery. So it kind of depended on where you lived in order for you to access that support. A third issue, and one which I'm sure we are all very familiar with even now, sadly, is a real threat to specialist services. And so what we saw and are still seeing is a real move towards generic services being awarded contracts. Often, those that don't have that specialism, but perhaps have a better, should we say, sort of cost budget appeal, but really sort of making sure that actually our response needed to be led by specialist services. What we also found is that there tends to be an emphasis on short-term new projects, something that runs for a couple of months, maybe a year, then it comes to an end, and then it's not sort of sustained, and that was creating a bit of insecurity in the sector. Moving on, what we also found in terms of our consultation and needs assessment was there tended to be an emphasis of risk over need. And this was probably due to resourcing, but also how we were viewing VAWG and it moving more towards a risk model over need. Competing priorities, not just within the VAWG sector, but what we found, and we sort of are based on the community safety team, is that VAWG sadly doesn't always get the centre focus that it should. COVID-19 has definitely done that now, but I think previously it was always competing with a number of other issues, which meant that it was not always getting the focus it needed. There was also a real need to have that long-term support, to have multi-agency approach to the way we work, and then really importantly, having an intersectional approach, one that recognized individual needs and provided a holistic approach rather than a one-size-fits-all. Next slide, please. So then this is where the Angelou Partnership came in, which was brilliant. And so really what the Angelou Partnership did was looked at each of those different needs and looked to remedy it by creating a real multi-agency range of different services coming together, each with their own specialism to meet need and to centre survivors. And so here is the model. You can see we've got two elements to the Angelou Partnership. You've got the VAWG Integrated Support Service, which is the front line, consisting of a range of different services, providing that specialism, that niche support that's needed across the VAWG strands. And then really important as well, the coordination service. So making sure that things are ticking along as they should be, making sure our framework is robust, making sure that our MARACs are coordinated, our operational groups are running, and spaces for different partners to come together, and that we have specialist domestic violence courts which are meeting the criminal justice needs of survivors. Next slide, please. And so what difference did this make? Apologies, that's a bit small, so you might have to strain your eyes. So I'm going to just touch on this because obviously Jess is going to explore it in more detail, but I really want to highlight that it did make a massive difference, and it is making a massive difference. So what the Angelou Partnership did is it provided a single front door for survivors, making services more accessible. This is so important because people, when they're experiencing abuse, aren't always sure where to go. Is it more of a domestic abuse service? Is it a sexual violence service? If they have a disability, will that be factored in? Will their needs around language be considered? This one service basically became the one front door that answered all of those questions. It created a sustained or actually increased service provision as well in specialist areas, as I mentioned, such as support for BME and the LGBTQ community. And then really important, I can't stress this enough, the councils gained access to additional services provided by the Angelou Partnership. I feel really humbled and grateful that not only do we get what we commission, but actually the range of work that the providers bring in independently adds so much value to the local response. Within the Angelou Partnership, and I'm sure they'll speak about this themselves, but there is that real sort of shared expertise and learning, supporting work, and thereby helping survivors effectively. And this one's really important. What I found that the Angelou Partnership does really well is it kind of elevated the role of smaller by and for organizations. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, when there's a move towards larger, more generic services, sometimes smaller organizations that provide that expertise miss out because they haven't got the same resource to kind of blow their own trumpet or apply for funds. And what's been amazing about this approach is it's really elevated and given a platform for these vital organizations. It enabled the councils to move into a more integrated and sustainable VAWG service system. And not the most glamorous of points, but really important, is it enabled the councils to pool budgets and really improve time management as the contract went from 13 through to this one by the Angelou Partnership. Next slide, please. So just wrapping up, because I know I haven't got very long. But what I suppose I wanted to kind of end on before I hand over to Jess, who's going to go into a lot more detail through the evaluation that Save Lives did, is that it's so important. This work has really highlighted to us the need to work within a coordinated community response. Ending VAWG is everyone's responsibility, and COVID has definitely really highlighted that. But there's a real need for us to kind of bind together and support one another within this framework. Thinking about COVID as well, absolutely, a lot of focus has been placed on the impact on survivors. But one of the things that we're really needing to take on board is what impact is that having on frontline services, the additional stress and pressures it's placing on these organisations. The other point I really want to highlight, and I've been highlighting it throughout, but just really emphasising the need for those specialist services. I think when we recognise that the violence against women and girls work has really borne out of women's rights organisations, through grassroots groups, through feminist movements, it's so important that that stays very much at the heart of the work that we do, especially as there's more and more of a move towards it becoming should we say, a sort of government priority, as it becomes what's the word, as it becomes part of legislation and it becomes a statutory duty, great, but how do we maintain that grassroots feminism within that response? And then lastly, sort of linking onto that, how can we really utilise the national guidance and legislation to support the work that's happening locally without it diluting and in any way impacting negatively on the great stuff that's happening locally? So that's it from me. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Jess now, who's going to go into a bit more detail over the awesomeness that is the Angeli Partnership. Thank you.
Hi there, everyone. I'm really delighted to be able to join you today. My name's Jess, and as Nikki said, I'm the Head of Public Affairs and Policy for Safe Lives. Next slide, please. And next slide. So very quickly, Safe Lives is a second-tier charity. We use our data, evidence, frontline practice, as well as, importantly, survivor voice to help understand and evaluate responses to improve domestic abuse responses for the whole family. So that's for all victims, adult, teens and child victims, as well as, importantly, keeping the focus on the perpetrator. We say we want what you want for your best friend. That's action from before harm occurs all the way through to the ability for people to live life after harm has happened. Next slide, please. So in 2018, the three councils commissioned Safe Lives through our consultancy team to undertake an independent evaluation of the VAWG ISS and meeting survivors where they are. It was intended that this was to help inform future services planning, as well as to give a really good overview of the outcomes and impact produced by the Angeli Partnership. We tried to understand how this particularly brilliant approach to service delivery did impact on both clients accessing those services, as well as looking at the impact it had on the three boroughs themselves and the way that they approached funding and commissioning of VAWG. Next slide, please. So there were two parts to the evaluation. The first looked at data provided by Advance. We reviewed lots of documents, including minutes of meetings, and we interviewed all of the 10 Angeli Partnership members. We also had interviews with stakeholders from across the sectors involved and, of course, the boroughs, as well as focus groups and one-to-one interviews with 10 service users. In part two, we had interviews with the provider organisations, as well as interviews with service users again, and additional case studies to look at those paths of service users. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of all of the kind of data, but also the organisations involved in this incredibly impressive partnership. Next slide, please. So first of all, what stakeholders told us was that actually this partnership approach was really, really impactful, and it really, really was working for both the services involved and also for the clients they worked with. It's that bringing together of specialist services and that ease of access, that equality of access for all communities, one AP partnership told us, a stakeholder told us. One service user said, "I can't thank my ISVA enough for what she's done. I honestly believe she saved my life," demonstrating the huge impact there. And one final partnership stakeholder told us that it's so comprehensive and well publicised that actually it's become a victim of its own success, because actually there is this increase in referrals because everyone knows how to do it, that got really, really good relationships with each other. So the challenge now is, how do you ensure that actually there is that funding and commissioning for the increased capacity that is now required? Next slide, please. So our findings for meeting survivors where they are found that service users had better knowledge of the support available. So once again, meant they were more likely to access the support. Crucially, they're enabled to access wraparound support, which helps to reduce service users' vulnerability and the risk of future re-victimisation. Really, really important, showing that kind of early intervention approach. Obviously, an improvement in quality of life, with holistic support helping to address trauma and providing coping mechanisms. Service users also had increased emotional and psychological resilience and reduced isolation. So what we found was that the established outcomes actually were expanded. So we found more evidence of outcomes beyond that that was in the initial contract. And service users are less likely to experience domestic abuse in the future because they not only have a better understanding of domestic abuse, but they're also better informed about how to seek support and feel comfortable doing so. Really, really important aspect of our findings. Next slide, please. The benefits for service provision were the provision of single coordinated seamless service, quality, empowering practical advocacy and support that's responsive to the needs of survivors. There was created or sustained or increased service provision in specialist areas. We heard about that. Really important by and for services, so Black, Asian, minoritized services for women, LGBT+, as well as sexual violence. It's something that we know from other areas of the country is often not in evidence at all. There was also created a professional network of organisations, and obviously that meant that there was shared expertise and learning. And then finally, there was an understanding of the dynamics of violence and abuse with specialisms across VAWG. And we know that actually no person experiences just one form of VAWG in isolation from the rest of their experience. So that was really, really important to have that VAWG overview. Next slide, please. So what was the impact working as a partnership for multi-agency partners? Many of the same sorts of findings. Benefits to partners were ease of access for service users, the specialist services provided, obviously the expertise brought by those individual members of the partnership. Though there were some challenges. So for example, we found that there was a kind of variation in the service offer across the 3 boroughs, mainly due to kind of differences in the funding in terms of relation to local priorities. So that was one issue. And there was also kind of some challenges in terms of data and outcomes and feedback loops. There were gaps in funded provision for certain groups, such as high-risk victims below the MARAC threshold, and something that at Safe Lives we're always really concerned about is that high risk does not just mean MARAC. Next slide, please. But huge benefits to local authorities working this way. Ability to pool expertise, obviously having a single VAWG lead across all 3 boroughs. Once again, we've heard already that ability to pool budgets. Single point of contact, via Advance, which was obviously the lead partner, and that pioneering of joined up public services, which meant that there was much better accessibility for survivors. Also, a significant value for money, as you might expect with a model like this, but we definitely found that. But once again, there were some challenges to local authorities working in this way. There was a sense of dilution and connection to some of the services, but that was something to do with the way in which the kind of VAWG board was chaired. There was also reduced incentive to increase budgetary contributions. So while you could see the real benefits of the kind of cost efficiency, actually because it wasn't all accruing to one council, that meant that actually there needed to be a lot more of that kind of commitment to increase, and particularly because, as I say, what we found was that this service actually increased demand. A lack of clear shared understanding of the context, particularly of those issues facing vulnerable service users, and that there needed to be an updated set of strategic priorities in the face of budget restrictions and increased referrals. So once again, it's that kind of phrase, victim of its own success. Actually, there needed to be a moving forward to recognise that it had been really successful, but now actually funding and priorities needed to change. Next slide, please. So just finally, wanted to just share the fact that obviously since we did this review, things have really changed. We know that the sector was already under huge strain from a lack of resourcing. And so, for example, our data on MARAC numbers showed that it had been increasing year on year over the last 5 years. So, demand, was always an issue pre-pandemic. But post-pandemic, we have seen demand increase hugely. We did a number of surveys throughout the pandemic, and we found that early evidence that 2 in 5 services had seen an increase in caseloads. But our recent survey that was done in the autumn found that 90% of specialist services said that there had been an increase in demand for their services. So that first sort of survey was done in June time, and then by the autumn, all services were really seeing that huge increase in demand. So we know that even prior to COVID, there was obviously a sort of lack of sustainable long-term funding, and particularly for you know, all the family across all risk levels. But actually now, since the pandemic, that has turbocharged the need to ensure that there is funding to match what services are now seeing on the ground. Next slide, please.
Jess,
that was a bit of a
great.
Thank
I was
you.
going to say,
yeah, that's the end.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. And I'm going to hand back to Nikki now.
Thank you so much, Jess and Shabana. We only have 1 or 2 minutes for questions. So Shabana, may I put one to you? How does the model outlined link with the suggestion as part of the Domestic Abuse Bill statutory duty Tier 1, Tier 2 authorities? Just briefly.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's a tricky question because we're still very much in the process of trying to figure out what that looks like on the ground. Obviously, for London boroughs, we're working more closely with the GLA, which might differ for national partners in terms of their relationship. I think it's a good opportunity, of course, for us to make sure that statutory partners are held to account and are actually providing for victims and survivors the support that they need and deserve. I think there's a lot of question marks around what does that mean in terms of funding? It means what does that look like in terms of relationships with each of the boroughs? There's some question marks around sort of pan-London approach versus local approach. So although it's definitely welcome, and we're engaging in conversations with the GLA, because we're still kind of finding out information in drips and drabs, there's quite a few question marks around what that actually looks like. The good thing is it's really sort of got housing. I mean, housing has always been brilliant, but it's definitely put a bit of pressure on them to make sure that they're in line with it as well. So for me, anything that gets different organisations and teams to be accountable and to make sure that they are meeting the needs is good. It's just how that works. And I think for me, I'm always a little bit conscious of national direction and how that impacts on the local. So as long as we can kind of fight the corner here, I'm sure we can make it work. But it's a bit of a woolly answer because we're still kind of figuring it out as it goes, and we're yet to kind of get as much detail from MHCRG as we would like.
Good. Thank you, Shabana. There's one more question about commissioning the model and frontline services within COVID. And again, to you, I'm afraid.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think it's so important that we look at the impact COVID has had. But I want to pick up on Jess's point, which is really important, is that a lot of these issues existed pre-COVID. And these have been ongoing issues, which locally we've really been trying to prioritize and highlight to people in a not to sound too odd, but in a good way. COVID has kind of shone that light and has made people to think, actually, this is something we should be responding to. I think post-COVID, for me, it's very much about how we retain that interest, how we make sure that it doesn't slip as soon as we emerge from lockdown and something else takes over. I mentioned competing priorities before, but I think also it's going to have to really make us think more about long-term support. We had a meeting yesterday and Melissa actually made a really good point, which was actually the long-term mental health impacts of COVID is something we need to be planning for. So I do feel that there needs to be a review of need in light of COVID without losing the fact that it was a massive issue pre-COVID and looking at how we can sustain that interest.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Jess, there are questions for you and I'll send them to answer privately if that's okay, because we've run out of time. But thank you to Jess and Shabana for this and for putting a framework to the next part of the presentation. I'll hand over to Melissa, and who will talk about how we approached an intersectional VAWG response.
Thanks, Nikki. So yes, okay. So thanks, Nikki, and thanks, Shabana and Jess. So as Nikki was saying, I'm going to discuss why a whole VAWG intersectional services and approach is needed, and how we see it all working from the Angelo partnership perspective. Next slide, please. So I'm going to look at Thanks. So how pervasive and prevalent is VAWG? Well, it's extremely pervasive. A lot of deaths are due to it. In 2018 alone, 20% of all homicides were domestic abuse murders. And you'll see more about this in a minute. Next slide, please. And so, yes, not every homicide has to do with it, yes. And yeah, next slide, please, thanks. And so, as you see, it's extremely pervasive, all forms of violence against women and girls. There's quite a few numbers and it all keeps increasing. Next slide, please, after that. So as you see, domestic abuse, which has been increasing, it's increased between 2011 to 2019 by 48%. There was a further increase in 2020, so this past year, of a further 9%. There's been an increase in domestic homicide murders from 9 in 2017 to 29 in 2018. And in 2020, there was a further increase of 27%. And this is despite the fact there was reductions in murders overall, but domestic homicides continue to increase. But it's not just about domestic abuse, it's also about sexual violence. Sexual violence is on the rise. Statistics reveal that over 14% increase in 2018. And out of that, 16% was an increase in rapes. Also, other forms of violence also have been increasing. Like for instance, in 2018, Forced Marriage Unit found that they had the largest numbers that they had had since the count that I was looking at 2011, started looking at, and that was a 13% increase in cases that came to their awareness. Next slide, please. So there's a very high impact on children, and there's a big link between safeguarding and violence against women and girls. And as you can see, there's a lot of children's deaths are due to abuse. Next slide, please. So, so why is it that we have a whole VAWG service approach? Well, it's very much what we see is that it's needed because it needs to be by a buy-in and for the very community who have in-depth specialist knowledge, so that survivors who come through to us, they don't need to explain their identity. They don't have to explain what different risks they face compared to other people and different risks within that. And it's a much better needs met service. Our approach is needed because it's also the way that we access survivors and we build trust, and that helps to get further disclosures. For instance, if you have an LGBT person, some of the barriers that they might face in terms of getting support from other services or from just barriers to disclosing is they might be afraid of being outed. But if they speak to another person who's a specialist in terms of VAWG and who's LGBT, they know that they don't have to explain this part of their story. It's very similar with women's services, as we know that violence against women and girls is a gender-based crime. It's also similar if you look at specific BME different communities. For instance, some of whom don't feel safe to report to professionals, and they fear that the police and home office involvement. And this is due to their trust being broken over time by these different agencies. For instance, we have an organization who knows the best way to build engagement is to go out and have a regular couscous dinner, which is where they then get the community to come in, and that's how they very much then start building links so that they can then get disclosures. We also very much believe that an intersectional approach is needed, and it's needed because survivors have multiple facets and dimensions to their identity. And so we had to create a service and a project that very much addressed people, that supports all of them and doesn't look at it in isolation. Because for instance, a survivor is not just a woman. She's not just Polish or Spanish or Muslim or Jewish or has African heritage or has a disability. She's actually the combination of all of those different things. And she's experienced inequality from different aspects of her identity. So we need to look at all of them and not look at them in silo if we're going to best support her. Likewise, it's very common to experience multiple forms of abuse, and these often overlap. And this also increases further risks of further abuse and death that somebody might face. For instance, you might have a domestic abuse survivor who her perpetrator is her husband, who's also been raping her, and she's afraid to tell her family members because she thinks that they're going to blame her, shame her, and isolate her, and there'll be honor-based violence. So if we're really going to support people, we must consider everything and anything that can marginalize them. And so that's what we did. We created a service that addresses and supports people across this wide spectrum. Next slide, please. And so why was it needed for the boroughs? Well, it was very much needed for the boroughs to come together to draw the different dots and improve the coordination. Sorry. because we'll have survivors who will come to different departments. They might come to housing or social care, but if those departments are not speaking to each other about what they're doing and looking at it also from a VAWG perspective, it then means that there's a lot of cost of lost resources and it's a lot less effective. And so what the Angelo Partnership does is the Angelo Partnership very much facilitates this dialogue. We also know that survivors are going to cross borough lines. And we also know that there's a need for more resource, as we've seen before, the increase is demanding, as is need. So we need to pool resources. Next slide, please. It was also needed for the charities. It was needed for the charities to have a much more structured way of working. So there wasn't duplication, there was better support, and it was much more streamlined for people to be able to navigate. It also was because resources were shrinking, so we had to join together to make more out of it. And it's also much better for service users because the more joined up you are, that means that they don't have to speak to numerous people. So overall, it's better for survivors who are net sent from pillar to post. There's more collaboration, there's more coordination across stakeholders and services. And so it makes a better improved system. Next slide, please. So this is the strategy that we were working towards at that time. And then the next across the VAWG partnership. Next slide, please. This next slide is what the Angelo Partnership actually looks like. And each of the different organizations have specialisms from domestic abuse to stalking, sexual violence, different BME communities, perpetrator work, LGBT work, and so forth. Next slide, please. So how do we develop? Well, in 2014, after about 2 to 3 years of conversations about how to best recommission the service and get the strongest service possible, 9 organizations got together to form the Angelo Partnership. And in 2015, the service went live. And we are very much the service delivery element of the coordinated community response. And Advance coordinates the service delivery element of this by leading the Angelo Partnership. We took what the coordinated community response was, and we expanded it so that it went beyond just criminal justice work. The project is now delivered by 10 different organizations who you're going to hear from in a minute. And in 2018, we further expanded and we had Meeting Survivors Where They Are, which is a much more a step down recovery project that Jess was talking about in terms of the evaluation as well. Next slide, please. So why is it that we're so unique? Well, we very much believe, as you can see here, that the sum of our parts are much better and much more effective in combination. We also look at making sure that we're needs-based, we're intersectional, that we have community-specific responses, that we're a coordinated response of whole system VAWG specialists. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from one of our stakeholders, who, as you can see, that they were saying that we are extremely comprehensive and wide-reaching. Next slide, please. And then this is a slide. This is a quote from another stakeholder, a health professional, who was saying that we are a bit of a rock for professionals in tough times. Next slide, please. So how do we know that it's worked? Well, we know that it's been working because we have improved access. Referrals are increasing, and they're 27% over the target if you look across the years. This year in the pandemic, needs have been further increasing. It's now taking a good at least 3 times more time to support every survivor than it was prior. And also referrals are much higher than they were for the last 2 preceding years. We also are reaching people, a good 60% of people belonging to different ethnic communities. And this is in contrast to the boroughs who have about 29 to 38% per borough. We're also getting referrals, as you can see, from a wide variety of ranges. Next slide, please. So what we do in Angelo is we cover all of the different forms of violence against women and girls. As you can see, the majority of our referrals are for domestic abuse, which does cover things like emotional abuse and psychological abuse, as well as physical abuse. And then the second most common reason for referral in is sexual violence and abuse. Next slide, please. So how do we know in terms of our outcomes that it's been working? Well, we have really high outcomes, as you can see. And you can see that pretty much basically immediately we surpassed our baseline in 2015. And we continue to build and continue to further increase this. Next slide, please. And then this is more quotes specifically about the outcomes, so you can see in real time what we did in terms of supporting people with multiple disadvantage and improving their lives. And for instance, this survivor who said she's now able to take the tube on her own and go to the cinema as a result of our groups and breaking isolation. And another one who said she didn't trust professionals prior to working with us. Next slide, please. So what does this lead to? Well, it very much leads to continuous learning and innovation, and that attracts more funding for things like meeting survivors where they are. We've also had other projects that have come about because of the success of it, such as a new project for children and it's to do with social care, and we brought in about 300% more income. We also do a lot of capacity and expertise within the voluntary sector and statutory reporters, from things like monitoring evaluation to how to construct a full cost recovery equation for bids, to directly supporting other organizations or statutory sector organizations on how to identify and better respond to abuse for longer term outcomes. And very much what we are doing is we're very much looking at things from improving the whole system. And we take our learnings and we share them at both London and national levels to help build better infrastructure and co-commissioning. Thanks. Next up, you're going to hear about how we address VAWG and then different identities, and then there'll be a panel for a Q&A. So the first person is Sonia from Solus. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Melissa. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sanja, and I'm an ISVA team leader from Solus Rape Crisis. So we'll be talking a little bit about sexual violence response within VAWG. It is very important to emphasize that sexual violence is not limited to rape, and it's rooted in all aspects of VAWG, whether as a part of intimate relationship or as a tactic of war, honor killings, sexual trafficking, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, child sexual abuse or exploitation, and the list goes on. It is not a crime of passion. It is a violent, aggressive, and hostile act used to degrade, dominate, humiliate, terrorize, and control women. The hostility and aggression by the perpetrator are intended to threaten the victim's sense of self and violate her safety. Domestic violence studies indicate that 46% of women who experience sexual violence from their intimate partner. It is also difficult to establish the true prevalence of childhood sexual abuse due to underreporting, but data available suggest that between 7 to 36% of girls experience childhood sexual abuse. The trafficking of women and girls for prostitution is becoming one of the fastest growing areas of international crime activity. And despite the increase in reporting of rape and sexual violence in recent years, prosecution and convictions have dropped to the lowest since records began. In a recent rape report, which is led by Center for Women Justice, they conclude that rape and sexual abuse have been effectively decriminalized. And this is because the figures suggest that survivors now have 1 in 70 chance that a complaint made to police with regards to sexual violence will result in charging decision, let alone conviction. It is not surprising then that the proportion of victims withdrawing from criminal justice process has increased from 25% in 2015 to 41% last year. Sexual violence-related trauma has long impact on every aspect of survivor's life, most importantly, physical and mental health. The impact varies depending on age of victim at the time of abuse, duration and frequency and severity, as well as relationship to the perpetrator. But also very, very importantly, it depends on the support provided at the time of disclosure. And this is where we can make a difference by ensuring that survivors have access to trauma-informed, holistic, and coordinated support such as Angelo. Independent sexual violence advocates provide emotional and practical support to survivors in the aftermath of abuse. ISVA's main role is to support survivors to navigate complex, re-traumatizing, intrusive, and a very lengthy criminal justice process. We recognize that each survivor's experience is unique. However, common emotional reactions to sexual violence include guilt, shame, self-blame, anxiety, anger, isolation, humiliation, fear, confusion, and powerlessness. Our Angelo ISVAs support women and girls from the age of 13 plus who have experienced any forms of sexual violence at any time of their life. ISVAs work very closely with their Angelo partners to ensure that survivor benefits from all the expertise from the partnership and without being overwhelmed or confused where to go for support. ISVA's support goes beyond criminal justice process. They work with survivors to help them to get back control they have lost through sexual violence. And this is done through empowerment. They achieve this by supporting survivors the whole support is centered around a survivor, encouraging survivors to make their own informed decisions on every step of their journey. By supporting their self-esteem, by recognizing the courage of survivors to come forward, and by looking at the whole person and all the achievements that this person has achieved in their life. By continuously challenging myths and stereotypes, and by recognizing injustice. And not only injustice related to abuse itself, but also injustice related to criminal justice process. By providing access to knowledge and service information regarding criminal justice process, as well as other relevant support such as counseling, housing, benefits, and immigration, or whatever the service user needs at the time. And also by stressing how we value the feedback, ensuring that survivors know we value their feedback as well as their contribution in future service development. Our practice is, as Melissa mentioned, is based on intersectional feminist theory. I will now pass to my colleague Tal from Women and Girls Network, who will tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Sanya. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Tal. I'm the Advice Service and Helplines Manager at Women and Girls Network. I'm going to follow on from what Sanya and Melissa have just talked about and talk a little bit further about why we at Women and Girls Network work across the spectrum of VAWG and why we deliver all of our services from an intersectional Black feminist approach within a wider social justice framework. I'll try and give a bit of a flavor and an insight into what does it look like on a day-to-day delivery basis, and hopefully will help in demonstrating why you should all be looking at implementing similar model of delivery within your local area. So firstly, just very super quickly, Women and Girls Network is an organization which has been around for 33 years and been providing specialist wraparound support services for women and girls in London who have been affected by any form of violence against women and girls. Our specialism is sexual violence and young women's work, and as part of the Angelou partnership, we deliver dedicated advice hub, ISVA support, and young women advocacy support. So what do we mean when we say we work from an intersectional Black feminist approach? So we know that women and girls are likely to experience different types of abuse throughout their lives, and that those experiences are likely to be interconnected. So therefore, it's paramount that we look at and address all strands of VAWG in commissioning, designing, and delivery of specialist support. But that doesn't mean commissioning of one service to deliver all support for all survivors, so like one size fits all type thing. Because as you will hopefully hear and see from today, that partnership work and maintaining specialism is vital to ensuring support is effective and meet the needs of all survivors where they're at on their journey to recovery. So although most survivors may have some common experiences and shared support needs, we know that survivors of sexual violence, for example, are likely to face more specific needs and barriers throughout their journey. It can range from stuff like Sanya just mentioned about women not being able to access therapeutic support whilst they're going through the criminal justice process, and all the way to the specific manifestation of childhood sexual abuse related trauma and the detrimental impact all of those are having on women's well-being and mental health. It is important to understand and validate and respond directly to such experiences if we want to ensure that the support we offer is truly effective. So in order for this to happen, you have to have specialists dedicated SV support. And it's the same for young women's work. It's not enough, for example, to just have a sexual violence service that also accept referrals for young women. because young women experiences are unique and encompass multiple layers of interconnected experiences. So services which are not designed with young women for young women are not likely to reflect or understand and therefore effectively respond to those experiences. Now, Audre Lorde, who is my hero, said that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. So we know that women and girls experience multiple layers of oppression, like Melissa mentioned, and discrimination and abuse within the different spheres of their identity and throughout their lives. So VAWG is not experienced in silos. Other experiences of oppression, such as racism, classism, ableism, ageism, all the isms, will shape women's unique experiences within the world and will impact on the support they require and the barriers for accessing that support. So all layers of oppression are connected. We can't just focus on domestic abuse or even just on VAWG-related trauma and needs and ignore all those other experiences of oppression and their impact. Because when we do that, the support we offer doesn't truly meet the needs of women. So therefore, at Women and Girls Network, in order to create meaningful change, we challenge all forms of oppression within our work. And we do that both on the individual level and on the wider level via activism and strategic challenging of oppressive practice and systems. And as a partnership, as Angelou, we've done that a lot within the 3 boroughs that we work in. But what does it look like in practice? So Women and Girls Network, we believe that people most exposed to different forms of oppression understand best how to dismantle those oppressions. We believe that women are the experts of their own experience, and they are therefore the ones to guide and lead the support we offer. We make sure that survivors are at the heart of everything we do. So for example, we have a young women expert by experience advisory group, and they drive the design of all of our services, policies, and strategic vision. We strive to see every woman and girl who access our services as the unique individual she is, and we spend time truly getting to know her and understand her unique experiences. We do not have a kind of box standard package of support, but rather we work alongside women and girls, amplifying their voices and creating safe spaces where exploration of strength, of connections, of self-love, and subsequently healing from experiences of trauma can take place. Our support is really flexible, it's adaptable, it's trauma transformative, it's holistic, it's creative, and partnership work and specialism are really key to all of that, because we understand that we can't meet the needs of all survivors. And that's why kind of close working relationship and close partnership and meaningful partnership are key for that. So in order to ensure we design and deliver services which are truly responsive, transformative, and generate meaningful and lasting change, we need to make sure that our women's supports and healing spaces are truly inclusive, they're responsive to the interconnected nature of women's experiences of oppression and discrimination. Our spaces were never kind of designed to focus only on one aspect, very narrow aspect of women's oppression. And they need to be a place of warmth, of compassion and passion, where all forms of oppression against women are challenged and all women feel seen and heard for the unique individuals that they are. Thank you, everyone. I'm now going to hand over to Peter from Gallup.
Hi, Tal. Thank you. That was so powerful. I don't know if I can follow that, but thank you anyway. I'm Peter. I'm from Gallup, and we're an LGBT anti-violence charity, and we're part of Angelou, and we work with survivors who are experiencing domestic abuse for this partnership, but we also work with survivors who experience hate crime and sexual violence as well. I'm going to kind of just start in the short time I have with a kind of quote. Actually, it's a referral that we received just last week, actually. And I'll explain why I'm reading this. So please stop the victim on the road. He was in a state of undress, bewilderment, paranoia, possibly on come down, and under the influence. He was sectioned and taken to hospital, and due to the concerns. And while in hospital, he was disclosed with possible domestic abuse or violence and said he was subjected to ongoing abuse from another male. Police are concerned about the victim and want Gallup to assist with signposting and safeguarding, and he may need a Spanish interpreter. The reason I read that out really is just, I think, to sort of focus on why we need a kind of intersectional and kind of response around kind of diversity as part of a kind of community coordinated response. I mean, in that case, I mean, you can see it doesn't kind of fit what you'd say is the sort of more traditional narrative of domestic abuse, and there's a lot going on there in terms of the survivor's mental health, problematic use of substances, barriers around language, and also being a gay or bi male survivor as well. So we think it's really important as part of a coordinated community response to focus on those survivors who might be thought of harder to reach or harder to engage with services, i.e., who's missing from that kind of response. And to answer that, I think, as Tal has just said, actually, it's often survivors who are perhaps more marginalised, have intersecting identities, complex needs, and additional protected characteristics as well. So as I said, Gallup worked with LGBT survivors of domestic abuse within the Angelou Partnership, and obviously we have also as a national reach as well. And as Jess said as well, often that kind of intervention is missing in most parts of the country. So Safe Lives research found that about 1% of MARACs nationally had referrals from LGBT survivors, and many didn't record or represent any cases at all. So clearly there are opportunities being missed in those kind of responses. I think it's an achievement of Angelou actually, and for example, our work with Standing Together, who coordinate the MARACs in the boroughs, that we see a far higher proportion of LGBT cases. Often they're in sort of double percentage figures. And it's important, I think, as well within that kind of coordinated community response that there's a specialist LGBT service to support and advocate for these survivors and ensure that they don't fall through the cracks. And as Shabana said, I think Angelou took this approach from the beginning, and it's put diversity at the forefront, and it really reflects the kind of makeup of survivors in the tri-borough. And so I think that again, the CCR needs to respond to a range of survivors, and there's challenges around that, of course, with diversity and inclusion. So for me, as kind of the only male speaker on the panel, I'm aware that there's always this question that quite rightly, I think, centres on how that kind of CCR can rightly be centred on VAWG, for the reasons Melissa has outlined there, but also, for example, how it can respond to other survivors. So, for example, male or non-binary survivors, if that example I've given. I don't have the answer to that in 3 minutes, but I think what we'd argue at Gallup is not for making services gender neutral or having sort of generic services. It's not going to meet everyone's needs, and we need specialists buy-in for organizations. We'd argue perhaps for an approach which is for example gender responsive, so where being a specialist organization as part of a VAWG partnership, Gallup's able to kind of pick up and work with those kind of other people that might be missed, for example, gay and bi and trans male survivors, as well as LBT women whose needs wouldn't be met otherwise. And we'd also say that, I think as we've heard before, the survivor's identity always matters. So in Gallup, with respect to sort of sexuality, sex and gender identity, for example, as well as those other intersectional identities, including LGBT people, of colour, disability and class, for example, it all directly impacts on their experiences of domestic abuse and other forms of VAWG. And it can impact on services understanding and response to the survivor, and practically how that looks, as Melissa said, LGBT or LBT women, for example, having their identities used against them as part of coercion and control, threats to out, unstable immigration status used against them, and other harmful cultural practices such as so-called conversion therapies to cure people. And so I think if you don't take into someone's account of their sexuality, gender identity, or other kind of issues, then I think you're not going to have that full understanding. And I think the very last thing I'd say is those barriers to accessing services, and we shouldn't just simply put the onus on survivors being hard to reach, etc. But it's the barriers that exist to getting them to the support they need. and it is about that kind of specialist services as part of the coordinated community response, where that survivor doesn't have to explain themselves or educate people about their identities or their faith or sexuality, for example. I'll stop there and I will hand over to Fatima from Al Hassaniya. Thank you for listening.
You're on mute, Fatima. You need to take yourself off.
How am I doing so far?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm Fatima Morad and I'm the chair of Al Hassaniya Moroccan Women's Centre. I'm also trustee and have been a trustee for the last 25 years. Our organisation was established in 1985 to bridge the gap between statutory services providers and actual service delivery to our client group. And our client group is Arabic-speaking women and their families. This main client group is primarily situated in Kensington and Chelsea, which is one of the richest boroughs and also has one of the poorest wards. The ward is Goulburn Ward, and this is where our Moroccan migrant community first came in the 1960s. A study in 2017 by the Trust for London and the New Policy Institute found that Kensington and Chelsea had the greatest income inequality in any London borough. Arabic is the second spoken language in this borough. So migration for us, what we know is it forces people to leave their homeland, but often the homeland and its traditions and its customs and its ways of life seldom leave them. These cultural and traditional beliefs are often not transient, but rather passed on to future generations. So having the knowledge and the skills for those in those areas allows us to meet these often very complex needs. Addressing the needs of any group within our diverse society is sacrosanct to a just and inclusive society. If we are to accept that our diverse society has multiple identities, then these identities need to be addressed in a specific service delivery to ensure we remain just and inclusive. Failing this, we will see the issue, I think, continuing for future generations and possibly impact on the wider society. For years, Al Hassaniya supported its women through specialist and holistic approaches, ensuring all of our projects are tailor-made to meet the needs of the women and families that come to us. From supporting them with domestic violence to ensuring they are independent and able to integrate into the wider society. However, supporting women and young girls experiencing DV for us was particularly challenging. This is because what we did, we were operated as a single agency against a mass waves of other service providers that didn't necessarily understand the essential of cross-cultural communication and sensitivity needed in these areas. Therefore, joining the partnership was one of the crucial missing piece of the jigsaw. It provided an inclusive provision that allows the specialist service delivery. I would say the Andrew Partnership, I think everybody has said this so far, is that it's a formidable partnership that addresses the diverse identities of those who are a minority in our society. The partnership setup takes away the need, again, other colleagues have already said this, but it takes away the need to seek outside help, such as interpreters, consultants, advisors, and greatly enhances the statutory service providers' delivery overall. In my view and our view, it complements rather than duplicates and often an incredibly good value for money service delivery. It is fast, I think, it's efficient and specific in its response to the need of clients seeking and wanting help from us. With the Andrew Partnership, it needs one referral The rest is taken from there, providing swift service that will render the victim from victim to survivor. Angelou Partnership has enhanced Al Hassania's work and allowed us to be more proactive in delivering a more inclusive service. The current legislation and statutory services can only be effective through comprehensive, tailor-made service that addresses the diversity of our society's population, and the Angelou Partnership does exactly that. I do want to just mention one of we are named our Angelou project. Maya Angelou's, one of her poems was Still Arise, and I want to say still we rise and we deliver to our women who need us every day. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass on to Zara.
Actually, we're coming back to the panel now.
Okay, sorry, there we are.
Okay, don't worry. So Leonie, if you could put everybody up, that'd be great. So we have just a couple minutes for our panel. And on our panel, we're going to have the speakers who you just heard from. So Sonia from Solus, Peter from Gallup, Fatima from Al Hassaniya, Tal from VAWG, and we are also having Zara from ICRO join us as well. We just have just a couple of minutes. So I'm actually going to just ask just one kind of quick fire question, actually. And before that, I saw a question in the chat that I just wanted to make sure that everybody in the Q&A, make sure that everybody is quite aware of where we come from with this. We are not saying one size fits all. We are definitely not saying one size fits all, because that's why we think it's so important to have all of these different organizations who have these different specialist elements all coming together. So in terms of the quick fire, I would say we know that that the pandemic is it's a trauma, and it's going to have something that has lasting impacts on people. So my question to all of you, and I will ask everybody individually quick fire, is how has it impacted on your work and that of survivors? If you could tell me in just one sentence of just a couple of words. Sana, you first.
One sentence, right, it's impacted the court delays, perpetrators who on bail and meant to stay on bail until the court in prison are released on bail. It's impacted service users emotionally. It's impacted ISVAs because they work from home with children talking about sexual violence the whole day long. Do I have another minute? Or shall I continue? I can't squeeze this in. I have a list. Like...
I know, it's a big question. Tal.
Everything that Sanya just said, plus I think we've also seen women spiraling into crisis, because whereas before pandemic they may had some systems in place which are positive, social interactions and safe spaces where they were accessing support, and all of that change over the pandemic. So we've seen a lot of women in mental health crisis. We've seen a lot of women, who present with high level of need, and we find it more challenging and more difficult to get statutory services to offer the support that they should be offering.
Thank you, Peter.
Hi, yeah, just very quick. So I'm just getting a cup of tea as you speak here. So I would say, yeah, absolutely agree with what everyone said. I think we found, we did a kind of survey the first lockdown, particularly young people. So again, young LGBT people, but I think all young people are experiencing higher kind of domestic abuse with at home, because they have fewer opportunities of kind of family-based abuse. And I just think more kind of that, as we said, those complex multiple needs have always been there, but I think they've kind of amplified under COVID, absolutely, and it's been really tough to have a response to that. But there are opportunities, I think, as well within that around, the VAWG being higher profile and things like remote counselling, those sorts of things. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Zara.
Pretty much what other speakers said, but I guess one example that we heard from one of our clients who is still living with the perpetrator she felt that coming to the counseling, one-to-one counseling and the group counseling that we had at Icarus office was a window of opportunity for her to have some alone time, and that was her safe space. And by during the pandemic, she doesn't have that anymore. So definitely the clients has been affected more in terms of accessing to services and yes. Yeah.
Thanks. And Fatima.
I think what we've seen a massive growth in the number of inquiries we've got to the point where we've now having to train a number of our staff to do the training for the IDVA, to become IDVA practitioners as well. The other thing we're seeing is that which has already been mentioned by colleagues, the growth in mental health and the need for remote counselling, and that's increased quite a lot.
Thank you, Fatima. So this will conclude our second Q&A section. I would say definitely also from the advanced perspective, it's very much what our other partners have said, that that there's a lot more complexity. There's a lot more. It's just even a lot more work within the partnership and with other partners, and sometimes it can be a little bit more challenging to reach them. And a lot of needs have grown and increased in this period, without a doubt, for survivors. So our next speaker is Lauren from Advance, and she is going to discuss what does this unique approach mean for survivors, their children, and the partnership. So thank you. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm Lauren Hart. I'm a Senior Services Manager for Advance, as Melissa says, and I'm going to be speaking to you about how our unique partnership works in practice, and what this means for survivors, before passing you on to our partners at Women's Trust, Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse, and from a survivor, Amjad Unabashedly, who will delve deeper into this. So next slide, please. As the Angelou Service Delivery Lead, Advance coordinates the Angelou response, as well as delivering frontline services. Advance streamlines access to the service, joining up provision, enabling survivors to easily access the right type of support for their particular needs through a main entry point with several additional entry points. Working in partnership enables us to get referrals to the most appropriate services quickly and easily. People have choice as to which of our services they wish to access across our range of specialisms, enabling them to tap into a broader pool of expertise from a single phone call. Due to this, service users are offered choice based on their individual experiences, wishes and support needs, without being required to repeat their stories to multiple agencies, decreasing the likelihood of secondary trauma and expediting access.
Sorry, Lauren, just interrupting you. If you don't mind speaking up closer to the camera, because the voice is a bit hard to hear. Thank you.
Get close up of me. Okay, due to this, service users are offered choice based on their individual experiences, wishes and support needs without being required to repeat their stories to multiple agencies, decreasing the likelihood of secondary trauma and expediting access. Offering service users choice supports their empowerment when fleeing abuse, as much choice has been taken from them already. It also increases the likelihood that the support they receive will be able to meet their particular needs, with co-produced and tailored support plans delivered by a worker who can empathise with their situation, particularly as they're likely to be part of the same community. Next slide, please. In order to get the full benefit of the expertise in our partnership, Angelou partners train each other in their specialist areas, enhancing the knowledge we each hold. The knowledge we have and share between us is further cascaded when each partner briefs, trains and upskills external agencies, weaving in knowledge we've shared with each other, as well as raising awareness of each other's services. In this way, we share and embed best practice with a diversity in mind. This extends to less formal arrangements also. An integral aspect of VAWG work is to improve responses for all victim survivors, whether they're accessing our support or not. A key setting for this is our institutional advocacy, where we model best practice and dispel myths around VAWG in our day-to-day contact with other stakeholders. Our shared knowledge improves the quality of each partner's institutional advocacy, a key part of this whole systems approach to change. As our project works with a by and for approach, where projects are based within communities, with support provided by members of the community in order to be accessed by members of that community, then the knowledge held in these communities is also cascaded to other partners as we celebrate and share our expertise. For example, Al Hassaniya is run by Moroccan and Arabic-speaking women and provides support to Moroccan and Arabic-speaking women. Al Hassaniya hold expert knowledge of the community they are part of, and this knowledge base is shared with other partners. Next slide, please. Our structure serves to spread training across stakeholders. As upskilling stakeholders is shared across projects and agencies, spreading our resources and our reach. As we network, we promote each other's services, representing each other, sharing publicity and the links that we make. As each organisation builds relationships with different stakeholders, we increase our ability to navigate through structures and resources. Co-located workers from other projects outside Angelou further our network and can be used to support Angelou staff. For example, Advance has co-located housing advisors in the boroughs that are not part of the Angelou service. But when Angelou partners have issues with housing, the Angelou housing advisors may have information, contacts or resources they can share to benefit the work of Angelou and the extended partnership. We are also able to pool our attendance at meetings and operational groups, maximising the resources at our disposal whilst responding to complex work across 3 busy boroughs. Next slide, please. As the lead partner, Advance coordinates and supports other partners in their work. Advance assists partners with their capacity, working with some partners individually. Smaller partners can be supported to write a bid or can be included in bids put forward by other member organisations. We share knowledge and resources around systems, monitoring and evaluation, and building models for full cost recovery. During the health crisis, we've been able to share planning and funding requests as part of our COVID-19 response. Having a lead partner ensures consistency in management and oversight. Advance develop partnership policies and procedures to align the practice of partners. Advance creates spaces to discuss work with the partners, to identify issues and to plan our responses, as well as to celebrate successes. We create a collective voice, which Advance takes forward to champion with stakeholders, driving towards best practice. Next slide, please. When we identify trends, as a group of diverse specialists, we're able to talk more broadly and with authority. We are more likely to be heard. This serves to amplify the voices of smaller organisations. This also serves to link partners into further funding, bringing them into other projects, even if they are unfunded in Angelou. Accessing unfunded or added value work enables us to identify or evidence needs that we may not otherwise be able to. For example, the need for step down and recovery work. In this way, we expand our work beyond a crisis intervention focus, offering prevention and longer-term holistic support. Advance takes the lead in pressing for change where gaps or barriers are identified, coordinating a response, whether this involves seeking additional funding or addressing structural issues and practice. Next slide, please. The partners together bring in over 1.5 million worth of funds on top of the Commission services. Each organisation builds around the Angelou projects, bringing in additional funding which contributes to the network and complements Angelou, speaking to a diverse range of needs and experiences. Angelou support is centred around short-term interventions. However, the range of our partnership enables us to meet longer-term needs, such as by offering group work and counselling. Angelou continuously bid for additional projects. These include for step-down and recovery work, enabling access to holistic support, to fully break the cycle of abuse. It includes whole housing approach projects and meeting survivors where they are to enable a whole system coordinated community response. Next slide, please. So our unique approach to service delivery provides added value for commissioners due to the range of additional services, expertise and resources that can be accessed. Each partner delivers extensive services outside of the Angelou Commission services, placing a vast range of knowledge and support within reach of service users and stakeholders. All the text seen here in green details additional services within or adjacent to Angelou, representing added value for commissioners. By accessing the Angelou partnership, service users are also able to tap into this wealth of expertise and into holistic services. No recourse to public fund specialists at ICRO, support for parents experiencing abuse from their adolescent children at DVIP, refuges through Hestia and Solace, support for women involved in the criminal justice system through Advance. LGBTQI+ specialist ISVAs at Gallup. So that's Independent Sexual Violence Advocates at Gallup. The Sexual Violence Gateway through Women and Girls Network and Solace, and age-specific and appropriate support across a number of services, ensuring that service users have access to appropriate support whatever their background or situation. Expertise in the partnership is held around domestic violence, including intimate partner violence and family violence, stalking and harassment, sexual violence with 2 of 3 London rape crisis service providers as partners, trafficking, child sexual exploitation and harmful cultural practices. Not all partners in Angelou are commissioned by the 3 councils. DVIP and Women's Trust secure outside funding in order to provide much needed complementary services for the partnership. All partners provide huge amounts of added value for funders on top of the commission service. Each organisation builds around the Angelou projects, bringing in additional funding which contributes to the network and complements Angelou, speaking to a diverse range of needs and experience. Angelou support is centred around short-term interventions. However, the range of our partnership enables us to also meet longer-term needs, such as by offering group work and counselling. Next slide, please. As well as direct outcomes for victims and survivors that we work with and their children, our unique approach fosters far-reaching results. Since Angelou started in 2015, we've delivered 287 training and awareness raising sessions, benefiting 6,187 stakeholders, including attendees of a talk by Al Hassaniya as part of a UN conference on best practice and domestic violence in the UK, and reaching many, many local young people who attended awareness raising sessions in their school held by Women and Girls Network. Advance have organised jointly held awareness raising events such as art exhibitions and talks. When we collaborate as a partnership, pooling our observations and expertise, we're able to identify patterns and issues with greater ease. Scrutinising gaps in support together led to us securing funding for further complementary services, such as meeting survivors where they are. Working closely to monitor changes during the health crisis led us to identify increasing mental health needs among service users and increased barriers to them accessing support, as well as raising gaps in provision for survivors of sexual violence. Advance lead on amplifying these concerns, getting these issues on the agenda at a strategic as well as operational level, and working with external partners to better meet the needs of survivors. In summary, to borrow a quote from Al Hassaniya, our strength is in our solidarity. So now I'm going to hand over to Goody Burnett, CEO of Standing Together, to tell you more about the coordinated community response.
Thanks, Lauren. It's really great to be here. I was just sat here listening to all of the presentations and just reflecting on obviously the mentions of the coordinated community response. For those that are on and haven't heard of that, I would highly recommend obviously you go and look at Ellen Pence's work, who started this work over 2 decades ago, and it was brought over with Advance and Standing Together over 2 decades ago. I think you can see from all of the speakers that where you have a really good CCR, what it means is it means that you've got a comprehensive, inclusive and holistic approach to bring statutory organisations and by and for services together, which essentially the aim is to obviously protect and keep safe women and children, and then obviously to hold perpetrators to account, which is really important. And I think in terms of like what I can add, because people have talked about the services in terms of Standing Together's role, I saw that someone put in the question about how you bring those statutory organisations alongside all of this. And that is a really key part. So anyone that's listening that hasn't read or seen In Search of Excellence is a piece of work that we did at Standing Together back in 2013 and just refreshed last year. And it was about looking at what local partnerships look like. And there's 12 components. And if you aren't aware of them, they can be used across the board in terms of making sure survivor voice is central, the intersectionality, and basically governance and how you bring things in. The other thing that's Standing Together in terms of the Angelou partnership, which we're so proud to be a part of, is we're involved in the operational group. So a housing operational group, children and mental health, and then also harmful practices, and a number of operational groups that basically bring the local specialist services and the statutory agencies together to make it joined up and acknowledged that it's all of our business. The other thing that I would like to do is obviously talk through some of the tools that you might not be aware of that are available, that have started in the local work, basically in the Borough and Hammersmith and Fulham, which is whole housing, which Lauren obviously talked about in terms of thinking about the private rented sector. We've got Housing First for women with multiple disadvantages in Westminster. So if you haven't heard about that, that's an amazing initiative. All of this stuff can be found in the Whole Housing Toolkit, which is free and is on the website. Also Whole Health, which we started in the local routes in our work within Chel West and the operational group, but also that's then branched out into more national. So there's a Pathfinder Toolkit. If you haven't heard about that, please go and look at it. We've also got the Specialist Domestic Abuse Courts, which we coordinate, and we've just been given money from the tampon tax to expand that to mental courts and think about what national rollout would look like. And that work has all started in the local in terms of the best practice that these partnerships have created. So I just wanted to highlight that. Obviously, we're responsible for coordinating the MARACs, and we've already heard mention of that and the shifts in COVID. And another amazing piece of work that started locally is Safe Communities, which is now expanded, if you haven't heard about it, the Faith and VAWG Coalition, which is a number of partners. And if you haven't heard about these initiatives, please just go on to the website, because obviously people are explaining what the specialist services, but I just thought I'd use my 5 minutes, because it's really short and sweet, to say there is a lots of resources, and I will try and put them in the chat just in case people haven't heard of them. And I think that's my 5 minutes up. So I'm going to hand over, just a second, I haven't missed anything, to Sharon from Hestia. Or is it?
I think you're
handing over to me.
Heidi,
I'm sorry. I was looking at the agenda and I thought it said Sharon. Sorry, Heidi.
No problem at all. Thank you, Goody. I'm Heidi, CEO of Women's Trust. We are a specialist domestic violence mental health provider addressing the emotional and mental harm caused to women by domestic abuse. So I'm speaking a bit more about the added value the partnership brings. It's really significant value the partnership brings to the commission contract in the 3 boroughs, not only with additional funding and services, but also the specialism and the expertise we have been talking about. It is what we do in the voluntary sector, achieving significant value for money. And with that, we very often are able to offer much more provision than is specifically commissioned and paid for. It is a worry, though, that this is more and more relied on by commissioners as a tool to subsidize contracts, as contract volumes very rarely cover the cost of the work expected within them. So all the partners provide added value in some form, as services are funded through various income streams, individually by the organizations, but also jointly as a partnership. And one of the examples was the project Meet Survivors, where they are. This has enabled us to meet other identified gaps in services. And as Lauren mentioned, to put that in the figure, so it's about 1.5 million every year added value to the partnership brings to this contract. We currently also have 2 members in the partnership which are not funded under the contract. This is a domestic violence intervention project, which works with perpetrators, while at the same time providing support for the survivors and their children, and Women's Trust. We have further 2 organizations who bring a lot of added value. One is Standing Together and Hestia, but both of them don't receive a lot of funding out of the contract. It's only small amounts, about £2,000. Women's Trust joined the partnership despite the lack of funding provision in the contract, as mental health had not been made one of the funded priorities, despite it being actually recognized as a need and gap during the strategic development process. But it felt vitally important to us to be part of this coordinated community response. Over the 6 years of the lifetime of the contract, we contributed approximately 1 million worth of specialist domestic abuse mental health services in the 3 boroughs, all secured through other funding sources. Many of the partners provide a variety of services, as you have already heard, working with specific issues, with specific client groups, which brings additional expertise and specialism to the partnership. The range of the specialism contributes and enables the partnership to meet diverse needs and gaps as identified. And I just thought I'd name a couple more services. I know we have heard a number already that are additionally provided under this contract. So we have, with the specialist BME survivors, the offer of counseling and access to legal support. Of our obviously therapeutic services we provide, there's floating support, complex needs outreach. We have the London Rape Crisis services within as offered within it. There's specific projects for client groups like older women. We have the Silver Project. And Goody already mentioned the work Standing Together is doing, and all the training that's also provided. It's obviously not a complete list, but I hope it gives you an idea. I would like to end speaking about the unstated understanding that the voluntary sector will do what it does well. We work together to meet people where they are, within their own communities, understand their needs, and support them on their own terms. This is why we succeed in supporting people. What I would like to highlight, though, is that it is clearly not going to be achieved by a single large organization working at scale. It requires diverse knowledge and skills, which is what the Angelo Partnership provides. Thank you. I will now hand over to Amja.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Amja of Amja Unabashedly, where love, art, and inspiration empower. I'm a survivor, artist, and activist. My experience with the Angelo Partnership and the whole VAWG services approach in a coordinated community response is akin to identifying the specific needs of a survivor from a trauma-informed lens. It's like going to the emergency room where the emergency staff compassionately, professionally, and strategically are supporting you within the gift of their expertise. And then with a further analysis, responding to the other elements of the trauma with a specialist referrals in a coordinated way. This working with a holistic approach supported me in reclaiming my agency because experiences of domestic abuse can equal stolen identity. Like for me, parental alienation was a massive identity theft. So in other words, advanced charity was like the emergency room for me, with staff who listened to my experience of domestic abuse and didn't minimize my experience because it wasn't directly physical abuse. Through Advance, I can say they gave me a sense of purpose when I was invited to be part of the See Her project, Survival and Hope Through Creativity, facilitated by the amazing and award-winning visual and performance artist, Rachel Gadsden. Change slide, please. Okay, so for the project, I created my first art piece, Perception. Perception gave me permission to reclaim my voice on canvas when my voice, the verbalization of my truth, was being lost in gaslighting and semantics. As a survivor, there are many things at a time that you're firefighting, like dealing with social services, the impact of economic abuse, looking for safe housing. But during that project, my truth is that it reminded me that I was so much more than my experience of abuse. Change slide, please. The Fall, again, Advanced Charity added to my purpose when I was referred to the Women's Trust charity with Heidi and her amazing team. There I was given a safe space to fall with intention, like it's captured in my art piece, The Fall, which is part of my new collection, Seasons of Resilience. Sometimes we have to fall, just similarly to great trees in the autumn, whose leaves fall so that the new ones can grow, so that we, the women who are impacted, can renew and grow again differently. Whether it was the workshops where I learned what to look for in healthy relationships, or how the emotional and physical, psychological impact of domestic abuse presented itself in our bodies, or the group therapy sessions where truth was shared with women of all hues and culture had a common understanding, or the one-on-one counseling sessions where I could talk or just be silent. Women's Trust support was a massive part in my recovery, which is why I'm here today and can able to speak to you, because I learned how to look at myself and learned how to draw on the tools within myself so that I could reclaim my agency and advocate for myself, or at the same time, reach for support when I didn't have this, the capacity to advocate for myself. Change slide, please. Risen. I was informally introduced to the Women and Girls Network at the Million Women's Rise March. Dr. Kima and her team embraced me. Being a woman in the world, as we know, we are faced with many challenges. When you're a woman in the world who has been racialized as Black, there are just some things that only another Black woman, due to the nuances within the culture, understands. And this is why the intersectionality and inclusion within the remit of domestic abuse support for me is paramount, so that all women and girls who have experienced domestic abuse feel fully heard. I attended a Women and Girls, a network called Thinking Under Fire. It was amazing. The solidarity was just like, wow. I took out my sketchbook, and that is what became, which is the piece Risen you're looking at here. In the art piece Risen, I have repurposed the Women and Girl Network Emancipation Stall, and I've used hands of women to come together of different hues. And I've also used the Ghanaian Adinkra sign of unity and diversity to clasp hands together. Arisen is dedicated to the Women and Girls Network and the Angelou Partnership. With their whole VAWG services, I was able to rise again. As I mentioned in the beginning, Amjad Unabashedly is where love, art, and inspiration empower. That is what I got from the Angelou Partnership. The strapline for my business actually is Let Art Be Your Becoming, because my introduction to the See Her project and everything that the Angelou Partnership did for me was my acknowledgement of my beginning, of my becoming, that was always within me. I just needed a coordinated community response to remind me. Thank you very much for listening. I think the next person is Katrina, maybe, because my agenda is slightly different. I'm sorry if I got it wrong.
No, you haven't got it wrong. You are just amazing. I'm sorry, I just put in the chat, what a woman. Thank you so much for all of that. We're going to do the panel now, so keep your video on, don't go anywhere. I'm kind of lost for words. You just, I don't know, you summed it all up there, didn't you, in terms of the strength of the partnership, which you can really see in the chat in terms of all of the different by and for specialism that is involved in the Angelou Partnership. And just so thank you so much for that, and your artwork as well. Wow, it's unbelievable. So thank you so much.
I hadn't done art until Advanced Charity, if I'm honest.
Serious?
Honestly, I don't know what happened, but given that opportunity, it just opened up something in me. That is why I truly say it was my becoming through Advance and the support that Angelou have given me.
Well, I feel very privileged to have met you just through this process and the event, and I'll be contacting you to talk about your artwork, because it's just brilliant. It really is. So thank you so much. So we've got a panel now. We've got Sharon from Hestia, and we've also got Katerina from DVIP, who I haven't spoken before, but we've got a number of questions. So I just wanted to give, obviously, Katerina and Hestia an opportunity, and Sharon an opportunity to be asked a question. So in terms of the lockdown and pandemic, how do you feel, or what have you seen in terms of the impact on your work with survivors, and like the biggest gaps that you might have seen as a result of COVID?
Yes, Hestia, we opened an emergency refuge because it did increase. Refuge spaces availability was low, and it did increase. So we opened up a specialist emergency COVID refuge in Westminster, and it's still there, where women can still be made safe and get the support and services that they need. So, work just carried on for us, but just in a different way.
Right, thanks very much, Sharon. And Katerina?
So at DVIP, we have both services for survivors and services for perpetrators. And if I focus on the perpetrator side of things, what COVID meant was immediately adjusting to a new way of delivering, keeping to the same standards. So all of a sudden, some of the work had to be done from the household, which raises different kinds of safety concerns. Sometimes the family is together. How do we do work safely? So a lot of conversations had to take place before we felt comfortable in changing the way we work. So COVID has definitely been a learning process. And in the meantime, we have resumed some face-to-face work, and we're still doing some online work in some circumstances. But there's some adjusting has been quite challenging, and also reinforces how we work. We're constantly adjusting. All of us are constantly reading what is needed and then figuring out how to respond to it. And that's what all of these organizations do all of the time. And this was another example of how that needed to happen.
Thank you so much. Heidi, I was really taken by what you, obviously in terms of mental health, it's been talked about quite a lot during this whole event, and you know, in terms of, as a mental health specialist, what do you think the lasting impact of COVID had, and how do you see the CCR, what do you think the CCR needs to do to basically try and tackle that? And I've also been thinking a lot about the frontline practitioners and their mental health too. So I don't know whether you wanted to say something about that as well, because it's a huge issue.
Yeah, probably we miss out on something. So the impact in generally is really the need of mental health service was always there. Kind of, we have been providing service. We are now 25 years old, so it's like that need. It's nothing new, yeah. But obviously, as everybody else said, yeah, the needs have become more. We have many more clients presenting with complex needs to us. We have also seen many more women in crisis coming to us. So we're dealing with women in crisis with suicidal thoughts. There's a lot of suicidal ideation support happening, which obviously also is we have to put in much more resource, because like I think one of the speakers said that earlier as well, that we're spending more time supporting individual women because of their additional needs that they are having. There's issues, we have given much more practical support, which we usually wouldn't do, where we can refer onto other services, but because they are overwhelmed, there is just not nowhere to go to, or there were times in between when we had the lockdowns where services weren't open at all. So there's a lot of more that has gone into that. I think this has really highlighted also, I think overall that domestic violence against women and girls is an enormous issue that needs funding. But for us particular as mental health service, we can't be just an add-on service. Yeah, we need to be part of these contracts, and not what happened to us a couple of times. Yeah, the money that's left for mental health is so small that we can't engage. So that's really, really important, yeah. And it's kind of then also not just looking at local authorities, but also making the links to health services. Yeah, so all the developments now, what's happening with the CCGs, yeah, I think there should be more funding coming from that sector as well. But yeah, I was speaking for all the organizations, so I think it is. We can't work in silo. Yeah, we need all the other organizations and services around that, and that's what Angelou does. Mental health of staff is a huge issue, I think, for all of us, and it's really difficult to tackle as we are really under pressure. My team is really constantly under pressure. We have also kind of then people then are burning out, also leaving us. And the other thing, we competing with our salaries against the NHS, so we're losing staff that way as well. So we can't keep up. It's hard to keep up the resources we need.
Yeah. And
then at the same time, you need to support your staff and making sure that they're okay. We see this also with the so it's all linked together. So having women with much increased trauma presenting to us is also a lot for our counsellors. Yeah, so we need to make sure that is leveled out. So it's quite a huge impact.
Thanks, Heidi. We've got 2 minutes left of the panel, and I really want the last word to come from Amja. And I was going to ask you, because we will have survivors potentially listening too. You know, and what would you say to anyone that's listening?
I would say reach for the support. I would say go to the Angeli Partnership and contact them and figure out which service area can support you. I mean, my life has totally changed. I didn't think I would ever get out of this. I think when you're experiencing domestic abuse, and for me as a woman has been racialized as Black in the world, sometimes you don't feel that you have a space that people are going to understand. But I went to Advanced Charity first. I then went to Women's Trust, and even within Women's Trust, I remember somebody saying, I don't know what it's like to be one of the staff. I don't know what it's like to be a Black woman, but I'm sure there is something that we can do to support you. And that is so important, because you want to feel heard. You want to feel that, you know, people are taking your experience and not minimizing it because it's not physical, or not minimizing you because you're not a white woman. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
There is support that the Angeli Partnership really do. It's amazing, honestly.
And that really frames this idea of that flexibility and meeting the women's needs, right? That Advance is about being real. Like, we can't necessarily, and we're not going to pretend that we can. Exactly. So we're going to find somebody that actually can meet your needs and work with you. The difference that makes. Thank you for articulating that so clearly, because I think it's just so vital, this whole event. That's what it's about. So thanks so much for the panel. We are now going to hand over to the force of nature that is Megan Field. So here she comes. And I'm going to put myself on mute. It's lovely to see you, and just so great to be part of this event.
Oh, thank you, Goody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay, and that you'll soon see my smiling face. It is absolutely amazing for me to be here talking to all of you this morning. I feel like I'm in a unique position to issue a call to action for commissioners, providers, and practitioners who want to improve their response, their coordinated community response to domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, and to ensure survivors get the best and most effective response to comprehensively meet the needs of their residents. 6 years ago, I was the Violence Against Women and Girls lead and commissioner of the Angeli Partnership, and now I'm a director at the lead organization Advance. So I've seen this contract from both sides and have watched it and the coordinated community response around it evolve since its infancy. The questions the commissioners were trying to answer all those years ago was, can we provide an intersectional and inclusive community-based service that recognizes specialisms and moves us towards a violence against women and girls response? And I feel that the answer was and continues to be a resounding yes to that question. The Angeli Partnership is a significant part of the VAWG services system in these 3 boroughs, and its example has impact far beyond the borough boundaries of Westminster, Hammersmith and Fulham, and Kensington and Chelsea. The Angeli Partnership is an example of collaboration and inclusion that we invite you to consider wherever you are and however you fit into the violence against women and girls services system in your area. The Angeli Partnership has proven a number of things. It's proven that you can fund and uplift smaller and specialist by and for organizations to be able to support survivors from a range of backgrounds with layered, intersecting VAWG experiences and identities, including from minoritized communities, including LGBT survivors, younger survivors, and survivors with multiple needs. And you can do this in an inclusive, gender and trauma-informed way. The Angeli Partnership has shown us that the move from domestic abuse to VAWG was made easier by collaboration with organizations who were specialists in these areas, specialists in domestic abuse, sexual violence, honor-based violence, forced marriage, and stalking, and not expecting one organization to be able to do it all. Angeli has shown us that local knowledge is key and should be considered at every part of the commissioning cycle. Whether you are analyzing the needs of all of your stakeholders and residents, whether you're co-designing specifications to meet those needs, creating commissioning processes that foster collaboration and inclusion, or monitoring and evaluating your current services in a transparent manner that creates an increased understanding of gaps and successes to inform the natural evolution of service delivery in your area. Angeli is an example of how this can be done and how this work can evolve over time in a local area. Angeli has shown us that especially when statutory finances are tight, and we know that most local authorities have lost at least 30% of their funding over the last decade, that you have to not just foster collaboration between providers, but also between funders as well. And as Shabana mentioned, and as Heidi and my colleagues have mentioned as well, Angelou Partnership has brought in millions of pounds in additional funding to the VAWG services system in our area, from grants, trusts, and foundation over the years, and has added immense value to the overarching offer to survivors. And on top of that, we have consistently worked alongside our statutory colleagues who are more ready than ever to respond to our requests because of the wider CCR. We've asked them to be part of the solution, not just by training staff, not by participating in the governance structure alone, but also by putting their hands into their pockets and financially contributing to shore up the system. This includes everybody: housing, social care, public health, CCGs, PCCs, everyone. So wherever you are, it's about reminding all professionals that this is a group effort and everybody's responsibility to tackle. If you want an excellent response like Angelou, that responds to the whole person, to all of your residents, and meets their multiple needs through the lens of their identities and complex experience of VAWG, you need to find multiple, creative, layered, and pooled ways to invest in this response and create conditions for this investment, which is, to sum it up, basically creating a coordinated community response and allowing us and honoring the added value of your providers. So to finish, the last 12 months have only shown us in the sector what we knew before the pandemic, that domestic abuse in VAWG had already reached epidemic proportions, and that the community-based services response, which are vital in meeting the needs of so many people, was at breaking point. And in response to this, the sector, the Angelou Partnerships, and our colleagues in the wider CCR have doubled down, meaning we have continued to do what it takes to shore up our organizations financially, to respond to the increasingly complex range of needs and risks that our service users come to us with, and to work alongside our statutory partners to enable them to do the same. With the DA bill and the emergence from the pandemic, we have the opportunity to create a new world. And in terms of domestic abuse in VAWG, if we are going to do this, we need to be addressing all of this in the way that the Angelou Partnership does. This last year has supercharged what was already happening, and we are going to be more vocal about the needs, the trauma, the violence in women's lives, and what it takes to end this epidemic. And now more than ever, people are talking about these issues as well. So we invite you to ask yourself what you can do to make your local community-based response more inclusive, more stable, more intersectional, and to go out and have those conversations about how to continue to build the right community response. This approach involves a different and more intentional way of working, but as you can see from everyone who's spoken today, it is worth it. It was worth it for AMJA and for the 20,000 survivors we've supported, and it will be transformational for the thousands of survivors in your area. This is not the time to decrease, but to hold steady and in fact increase both our levels of determination and funding in relation to ending violence against women and girls. It is this way that we will make the lives of ever more people safer and provide the widest range and menu of options for survivors with our community-based services at the center. Thank you so much, and it is my pleasure and privilege to hand it over to our Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you to you all for coming, and a huge shout out to Advance, the Angelou Partners, and Standing Together. I think I would be remiss if I didn't explain a little bit of my links to this partnership. And I will get to how that plays into the role of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. But I moved to London in the late 1990s. I had worked in the US at a state coalition against domestic abuse, and had worked for a few years. But then most of my career has been here in London, in the UK. And the very first place I landed was Advance. And when I came to Advance, I actually showed a picture of me not too long ago, sitting in the office at Advance. It was one room. And it was, and behind me in the room was a big stack of files, because we used paper files. So I'm aging myself now. And I worked with just one other person. That was it. And this is in the late 1990s when Standing Together, the partnership there had been formed by leaders in the council, very importantly, the women's sector, local leaders, fairly focused in the criminal justice response. However, that wasn't the whole of the Standing Together founders. And as Goody said, they had gone over to the US and they were very inspired by Ellen Pence. And the idea essentially of the coordinated response wasn't a cookie cutter notion of saying, well, let's go there and just do exactly what they're doing there here. It was very much about, let's set up a system of work where we actually invest in the way that we prioritize this issue within our own organizations and also how we work together. And in order to do that, they had to have a service delivery partner. They had to have someone who would be able to take these kind of community-based service referrals and need for support that wouldn't be people who'd be coming to the refuge necessarily, but it was a service they never had before. And that, without trying to speak too much on behalf of Advance, that's very much how Advance started, which was, you know, this idea of taking referrals from the police. If you wanted the police to do better and you wanted to hold partners to account, you had to have a service in place that would be able to take on those referrals. And then from that point on, it was very much through survivors' voices, and also Advance is the main person talking to survivors day in and day out, kind of improving the system and really making the systems work. And you can hear so wonderfully how that's built up in the last 20 some years. But I wanted to tell you that, not to make myself look old, which I am getting older, but it's more to just say, kind of to explain some of that development and some of where we've all come from, in terms of why we ask ourselves, why are we not further down the line? Domestic abuse is hugely important. Issues related to domestic abuse, sexual violence, stalking and harassment, so-called honor-based violence, forced marriage, all of these issues are so important. Why aren't we further down the road? And it's simply, one of the key reasons is that our systems and are lagging behind because they were never necessarily set up to address domestic abuse or understand domestic abuse and related issues. And so it's through these partnerships, these really early partnerships like Advance undertook and Standing Together started to do with its founders, that this has kind of grown over the years. And the reason why that relates to my current role as the designate domestic abuse commissioner for England and Wales is that that's exactly what the government agreed. So keep in mind, I don't speak for government. I'm not, I'm independent of government in my role, but the whole point of having a domestic abuse bill and domestic abuse commissioner's office was government's own acknowledgement that we have a huge road to go to get to where we need to be in terms of a coordinated community response and a provision of service that's adequate. So I just wanted to say that before I move on and to tell you a little, I just have to say a couple of things because I just think Megan summarized so beautifully the Angelou partnership and kind of, and all speakers did, and it's so great to see you all. I just want to say two quick things. One, because I was in the room when the bidding was all, or the bid for the Angelou partnership was being put together. And I just want to say to those of you who are watching and thinking, this looks amazing, I wish we could do this, but this is far off what we could do in our area. I just want to reinforce a few things that have been said. You know, one is that it took leadership from the local authority. This is the main contract. You just heard about 1.5 million kind of an additional funding that it gets brought in through these charities into the boroughs. But this was a very, and is an extremely important contract for Angelou Partners because of the fact that it kind of covers a good bit of the community-based services, certainly not all. And that's why I think local authorities have to be a bit humble when they undertake some of these commissioning projects, because they have to appreciate the added value that their partners in the third sector delivery agencies, service agencies like Angelou Partners are bringing to them and adding value to their own area. And yet that doesn't often come into the bids and decision making. But in this case, the partnership, meaning the local authorities partnership, made it 100% clear that they wanted this type of partnership. And so that created a really critical environment where people could take risks and come together. So what typically would happen in the mind of many of the Angelou partners is they want to maintain the contract. They look at that commissioning project and think, or process, and think, what are we going to do to keep going with the very good services that we offer? And it's a risk to come together. I mean, that's something maybe we haven't said but more clearly today. And it's important to say it's hard to come together and it's a risk to bid together. But what helps really mitigate that risk is when the local authority, in this case, Megan, who you just heard, who was in a previous role, which was great, and her colleagues kind of made and framed that discussion and made it very, very clear how much that kind of partnership would be valued. So they didn't promise that they would commission the Angelou partnership by any means, but it was a very fair commissioning process, but they made it clear that they wanted this kind of provision of service. And I think we need to really think very hard about our procurement and how we can encourage more of that. The second thing that I think needs highlighting is the issue of coordination. So I see this in many, many areas, and I've seen it work really well in the Triborough area, which is this value of coordination. So that's coordination of the Angelou partners. You know, when you have 9 organizations working together, you have to invest in and put some money aside for how those partners will coordinate and work together. They're very, very busy, as you've heard. They have a lot going on. To set up a partnership like this really requires a lot of coordination and leadership. And so that is something that really has to be highlighted in terms of wanting, if you're interested in this type of partnership, acknowledging that and investing in some coordination. And also some of that work that Goody talked about, so the wider operational work that goes on in and around the Angelou partnership, which of course makes hopefully their lives much easier. It's very hard to provide services if you're sitting in a chaotic environment where there's not a real drive for a coordinated response. I've personally worked in both. I've worked and seen what it feels like in this area, in the Triborough area, if you're still using that term, and in other areas. And I can tell you that's a huge difference. And that's a very consistent feedback that partners get. Police officers, housing officers, social workers will often say, wow, I've worked in other areas and I come here and everything's much more joined up and I feel so much better about the job I can do because it's so much more joined up. And again, some of that comes down to investing in coordination. How do you bring partners together and get things done? It's not only about the kind of training or policy. Those are all really good ingredients, but we have to invest in how we coordinate with each other. And that typically in this area has been through leaders in the Angelou partners and also standing together. And so I just wanted to say that I've put some of those thoughts. There's a green paper on procurement right now. And I've put some of those thoughts in a submission that my office has just put in this week about procurement and the need for a lot more thinking about some of the things we're talking about today. I'll tell you a little bit about my commitment in my last couple of minutes for domestic abuse as the commissioner. So we are doing some mapping, going back to the original aim of our office about what provision of services out there. A separate kind of activity is about what not only what's out there, but what should be there for the whole family, children, perpetrators to change, obviously adult survivors of domestic abuse. And so we hope to, in the coming year, map that more and more so that we can help to make the argument for a statutory duty, for a core funding for some of these services. I think it's my view that we have a lot of confusion about what core services ought to be there, and people who run these these services in the Angelou partnership spend a huge amount of their time cobbling together funding, keeping things going. that they've had, a cliff edge of funding for some part of their service. So, and I think that really surprises people. It probably doesn't surprise the people who've logged on to this webinar. And so we really need to have a more coherent way that we have core funding and allow all that money and funding rightfully from trusts and foundations and elsewhere to help supplement as well. But we need a much more strategic approach to how we fund these services. Why aren't they funded in that way yet? Again, back to me sitting in a room at Advance, with one other person and a stack of files. We really have innovated over the last 20 years, and our systems and the way that we fund this sector has not caught up with us yet. And it's really time for that. And we have no better year than to show us that. The other thing that my office is doing is we're able to through the domestic abuse bill, there's a duty to cooperate from public bodies. And there is a power in my office to make recommendations to public bodies that have to be responded to within 56 days. So I really see that as some really driving forces to help build more of a coordinated community response in a more strategic way. And we're really wanting to focus and look at strategic partnerships like you've seen today and bring the best out of those good practices. So how do we have a coordinated community response? It's not going to be the same everywhere. There'll be certain strands of work that will be very, very similar and really ought to be. But I think In Search of Excellence is a really great model of the kinds of things you'd want to look at in your partnership. And I'd encourage you to do this. I'm doing it with my own team, and the kind of ways we look at things is to look at those 12 elements and say, do we have a shared leadership in our partnership? Do we have equal representation where these services are sitting as equal partners at our table, not just commissioned services? Do we have the intersectionality and the survivor voice that we need? There's really great elements of that document that I would encourage you to look at. Last note, just before we go, the domestic abuse bill. We're at committee stage in the Lords. We're nearing very end, really critical votes coming up into the Commons very shortly. So if you've kind of lost track of the domestic abuse bill, it does a lot of amazing things. It still needs to do more. Migrant women are not covered in the domestic abuse bill at this time. We've had some interesting votes yesterday, and probably will do later tomorrow, where Lords are putting amendments that will go back to the House of Commons for a final vote. So changes to the bill that we haven't had opportunities yet to see what the Commons will do in terms of a vote. So this is a great time to be paying very close attention, getting involved with your MPs and making sure that they know from you what is important for the final version of this bill. So I would encourage you to take that challenge and put that on your to-do list if you haven't done it already. And I'll close there, and just a huge thank you to the Angelou Partnership. You have my, obviously, gratitude for all of the hard work you've put in this year. You are really changing lives. And I just want to thank you so much for letting me speak to you today.
Massive thank you, Nicole. As usual, everything has been said by everybody and beautifully summarized by Nicole in terms of the origins, the aims, but also the impact and challenges that we face as a partnership. Acknowledging really that this is the most effective way, not the easiest, but the best is not always the easiest, but the most effective way we can respond to the needs of the women, children, and indeed survivors widely that need our help and support. I will close by saying thank you to everyone who has contributed to this. You can really see that it's a joint effort. I know we've run a couple of minutes over, so thank you to all of you for staying with us for over 2 hours now. If you would like to get in touch with us and find out how we can support you to deliver this as commissioners, as practitioners, as policymakers, and share some of our expertise, there's details there. We'll also be putting a lot of this information on our website, certainly on the Advanced website, and also some of it on the Angelou website. If you're a woman or a survivor who needs to get help, please contact us. The details are on the slide that you can see. Help is confidential, it's free, and it's available to you. And finally, for any communications, there's details for Molly, who is able to respond to questions. Once again, thank you for everyone, and for those who haven't participated today, this is only the tip of the iceberg of everyone who makes this work. Thank you very much to all of our statutory agencies and to every woman, child, and survivor that have trusted us for to be able to support them on their journey to recovery. Have a lovely day, and see you next time.